Australia's a big country, and freedom's pumping bluey, and freedom's on the wallaby. Don't you hear her cooey? She's just begun to boomerang. She'll knock the tyrant silly. She's gonna light another fire and boil another billy. Our parents toiled for bitter bread while loafers thrived beside them. But food to eat and clothes to wear, their native land denied them. And so they left their native land in spite of their devotion. So they came, or if they stole, was sent across the ocean. Then freedom couldn't stand the glare. A royalty's regalia. She left the loafers where they were and came out to Australia. But now across the mighty main, the chains have come to bind her. She little thought to see again the wrong she left behind her. Toiled to make a home, hard grubbin', 'twasn't clearin'. They wasn't crowded much with lords when they was pioneering. But now that we have made the land a garden full of promise, old greed must crook his dirty hand and come to take it from us. So we must fly a rebel flag as others did before us, and we must sing a rebel song and join in rebel chorus. We'll make the tyrants feel the sting of those that they would throttle. They needn't say the fault is ours, blood should stain the wattle.
Welcome to Lit Poetry. Henry Lawson was one of Australia's most famous and beloved writers, distinguished in both poetry and short story writing, particularly for his vivid tales about the Australian bush. He is part of the Bush Ballad School of Poetry. Lawson was born on June 17th, 1867 in Grenfell, New South Wales. His father worked as a gold prospector, while his mother was a feminist and social radical. As a young boy, Lawson developed an illness that led to a hearing deficiency, which later became near deafness. This descent into deafness was one of the most important catalysts in him turning to writing. In between trying his hand at many kinds of work in his life, Lawson started to write poems and publish them in the Sydney Press. He also took up editing The Republican, a weekly radical paper his mother published. In 1891, he became a reporter for The Boomerang, a radical left-leaning paper in Brisbane, and later he was politically affiliated with The Bulletin, a Sydney-based newspaper that was highly influential in Australian life. Throughout much of his life, Lawson struggled with alcoholism and a nomadic lifestyle filled with experiences of both poverty and hardship. Yet in 1896 he married. That marriage, however, soon became strained over his drinking and reckless spending. Lawson entered rehab in an attempt to recover, only to fail. His wife collapsed from the strain of their relationship. While married, Lawson tried to commit suicide, and the following year his wife procured a judicial separation from her husband. Lawson continued to write in the later stages of his life, but never again reached the creative heights of his earliest works. His life was difficult, and at times he was homeless, a beggar, suffered from mental illness and was jailed for not paying child support. In September of 1922, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Discussion of the poem. The poem Freedom on the Wallaby was written and printed in The Worker in Brisbane on May 16, 1891. Lawson wrote this poem in response to the use of military force that was used to put down a shearers' strike of that year. And from this incident, therefore, was born one of Australia's greatest ever protest poems. Written for The Worker, the catchphrase, "Long live the worker," was a subtitle which occasionally accompanied the poem. At first glance, and maybe even second or third glance, this poem hardly seems the stuff of extremist, radical, political propaganda. But look at the imagery just from the first stanza. Aussie slang like humping bluey, referring to the swag itinerant workers carried with them. And on the wallaby, roaming or hopping here and there like a small kind of kangaroo, intermingled with the hardly anti-social sentiments of celebrating freedom and the knocking down of tyrants. How could a poem that opens with the impossibly simple observation that Australia is a big country possibly have led to calls made from the floor of Parliament for the arrest of its author on charges of sedition? Well, that's a good question, because that's exactly what did happen. The answer lies not in the opening lines, but in the closing lines. Freedom on the Wallaby was originally published in the left-leaning magazine The Worker, as I've already mentioned, as a response by Lawson to a conflict that pitted unionised sheep shearers versus non-unionised workers and their owners. Lawson's poem was not the only creative work to spring forth from this pivotal moment in the history of Australian politics and their workers. Lawson's poem, written midway through 1891, was considered by some very powerful politicians and businessmen at the time in Australia as not just pure propaganda, but an inflammatory incitement to violence. On July 15th, 1891, on the floor of the Queensland Legislative Council, Member of Parliament Frederick Brentnall stood up to read into the official record of the body's vote of thanks to armed strikebreakers the final two stanzas of Lawson's poem. It was the final four lines, however, that sealed the deal. "Will make the tyrants feel the sting of those that they would throttle. They needn't say the fault is ours if blood should stain the wattle." Those concluding two lines were nothing less than a political red flag to those powerful forces standing in opposition to the demands being made by the strikers. Lawson's poem essentially seemed to be saying that not only should those supporting the striking workers fight back against the strike breakers, but that all the blame for any violence which resulted from the conflict should be placed squarely upon the shoulders of the breakers, the very men that Brentnall and his minions were officially thanking in Parliament and labelling as Australian heroes. The result was unexpected. Immediate outrage, with calls for Lawson to be arrested on charges of sedition, broke forth in the Parliament. The focus of the poem is one that draws a parallel between the out-of-touch members of the loafing British aristocracy and Australian leaders cracking down on workers' rights by connecting the rebellious decision to leave England behind and found a new country with the decision to rebel in support of the striking wool workers. Although he never wound up being charged, and although the strike was eventually broken, and although the owners and the politicians supporting them could be declared winners in the short term, the longer arm of history would eventually declare Lawson on the side of the winners. The long-term outcome of the strike, which led to Lawson's poem, is still being felt today in the form of the Australian Labor Party, which originated in response to the political strike caused by the 1891 strike. A modern reading. The great thing about art such as poetry is that each new generation can reinterpret a work of art and draw new understanding and inspiration from it. And this is exactly what lit poetry and unmuzzled music has done here with this modern retelling of this particular poem. In Australia today, the issue of asylum seekers has never been more pressing. Our government's scandalous treatment of people seeking refuge in Australia is there for everyone to see. Australia's government has continued to circumvent their responsibilities as members of the United Nations to protect those people arriving on our shores having fled persecution in other lands. This has been partially achieved by the Australian government's highly dubious strategy of detaining asylum seekers in offshore processing facilities, which one could argue are institutions that could readily be reclassified as modern concentration camps. Freedom on the Wallaby speaks into this situation. The poem reminds us that modern Australians were once not that far away from being asylum seekers themselves, fleeing problems in one land in the hope of making a new start in another. Yet Australians, particularly of European descent, ignore their own heritage of having found freedom in Australia by not extending a generous welcoming hand to a new generation of people fleeing their homes in search of a new land too. Ironically, people simply forget their roots, just like most Christians conveniently forget the fact that their own founder, Jesus, was also a refugee forced to flee his home at birth to escape danger. Freedom on the Wallaby is a call for solidarity with people who are in crisis, people who are in trouble. The poem can be read as a call for solidarity with the dispossessed, oppressed and abused. It is a poem to be patriotic about. It is a poem about justice, generosity, freedom and fair play. When we think of others, the poem challenges us to remember what our roots are as well. Thank you.